What if I told you that the American frontier killed more people than all the wars America fought in the 19th century combined? That children as young as 6 walked 15 miles a day alongside wagons because riding was considered lazy? That professional buffalo hunters killed 4.5 million animals in just 3 years as official government policy? The frontier wasn't the romanticized Wild West you've seen in movies. It was brutal, bizarre, and absolutely fascinating in ways your textbook conveniently forgot to mention. Tonight, we're going to explore like 101 disturbing facts about the American frontier that somehow never made it into the official story. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare to learn some deeply weird history. But first, if you enjoy falling asleep to strange historical facts, go ahead and subscribe. It helps me keep making these late night history lessons for you. Now, let's begin with something that'll make you grateful for modern dentistry: frontier dentistry. So, here's the thing about teeth on the American frontier. If you had a toothache west of the Mississippi before the 1870s, you had exactly two options: live with it or find the nearest blacksmith. Yes, the same person who shoed your horse would also yank out your molar using the same tongs he used on horseshoes at the forge. The procedure was about as gentle as it sounds. Your anesthesia? A bottle of whiskey if you were lucky. Maybe two bottles if the blacksmith felt generous, or if you screamed loud enough to scare the livestock. People would bite down on leather straps, grip the sides of the chair, and pray it would be over quickly. Most folks just lived with rotting teeth until they fell out naturally, and most people had lost multiple teeth by age 30 from decay, infection, or trauma. The frontier had plenty of dangers to worry about, but somehow dental care ranked pretty high on the list of things that could ruin your week. And speaking of things that could ruin more than just your week, one-way tickets. Between 1840 and 1860, over 350,000 people died on the Oregon Trail. Let that sink in for a moment while you're getting comfortable. That works out to roughly one grave every 80 yards from Missouri all the way to Oregon. Imagine walking that path and seeing a marker, a cross, a pile of stones every single minute of your journey for months. Most graves were shallow, dug quickly by exhausted families who couldn't afford to stop for long. Disease, accidents, drowning at river crossings, and starvation claimed most of them. Children died frequently, parents died and left orphans. Sometimes entire families were wiped out within days of each other. The trail was littered with abandoned possessions, broken wagons, and the dreams of people who thought they were heading toward a better life. If you made it to Oregon, you were genuinely one of the lucky ones. But even survival didn't guarantee you'd escape the frontier's cruelty, especially when it came to the legal system. Frontier divorce. Here's a fun little legal loophole from the wild days of westward expansion. In many frontier territories, a man could divorce his wife without ever stepping foot in a courtroom. All he had to do was post a notice in the local newspaper for 3 consecutive weeks, stating that he was no longer responsible for her debts or actions. That was it. No judge, no hearing, no mutual agreement required. The woman in question often had no say in the matter whatsoever. She'd find out she was divorced by reading the town paper or hearing about it from a neighbor. This little arrangement left countless women stranded in remote territories with no legal recourse, no property rights, and often no way to get back east. Some remarried quickly out of sheer survival necessity. Others were left destitute. It was efficient, certainly, but calling it justice would be a stretch. And if you think that's harsh, wait until you hear about what was expected of children. Child labor on the trail. If you were a child on a wagon train heading west, riding in the wagon wasn't some kind of privilege. It was considered outright laziness. Kids as young as 6 years old were expected to walk 10 to 15 miles every single day alongside the oxen and wagons, their little legs keeping pace with adults, dust coating their faces, feet blistering in poorly made shoes, or sometimes no shoes at all. The wagons were reserved for supplies, the elderly, and the genuinely sick. If you complained about being tired, you were told to toughen up. If you fell behind, you risked being left behind. Children were expected to help with chores at every stop, too, gathering firewood, fetching water, watching younger siblings, cooking, cleaning. Childhood as we understand it today simply didn't exist on the trail. So, you were a small adult with responsibilities, and the frontier didn't care if you were ready for them. And those responsibilities became even more dire when disease arrived. Cholera Express. Cholera was the silent executioner of the American frontier. This waterborne disease could kill a healthy adult in 12 hours flat. You'd wake up feeling fine, drink from a contaminated stream, and be dead by nightfall. Entire wagon trains were wiped out overnight. Families would go to sleep and wake to find half their party dead or dying, their bodies racked with dehydration and fever. The dead were buried in shallow graves dug frantically by survivors who knew they might be next. By morning, wolves would often dig up those graves, scattering remains across the prairie. There was no time for proper funerals, no time for grief. You buried your loved ones and kept moving because staying in a contaminated area meant everyone would die. Cholera didn't discriminate. It took children, parents, and grandparents with equal efficiency. It was fast, it was ruthless, and it was everywhere. But at least it was impartial, unlike many other aspects of frontier life. The real cowboys. Here's something your history textbook probably glossed over. An estimated 1 in 4 cowboys were black. Many were formerly enslaved men who found work on cattle drives after the Civil War ended in 1865. They did the same backbreaking work as everyone else, rode the same dangerous trails, faced the same deadly river crossings and stampedes. Some became legendary for their skill with horses and cattle. But when the drives ended and the cowboys rode into town, segregation laws often meant black cowboys couldn't eat in the same restaurants, sleep in the same hotels, or drink in the same saloons as their white counterparts, even after working side by side for months. Their contributions were largely written out of popular history. Hollywood cast white actors in their stories. The image of the cowboy became whitewashed over time, erasing the diversity that actually existed. The real frontier was far more integrated than the movies ever showed. The frontier's violence wasn't always driven by hatred. Sometimes it was purely transactional, and sometimes it was paid for with human lives. Scalp bounties. Multiple states and territories offered cash bounties for Native American scalps. Men, women, and children. California paid $5 per scalp in 1856. Other territories had similar programs. The idea was to encourage settlers to defend themselves and reduce the native population through financial incentive. It turned murder into a paying job. Bounty hunters would raid peaceful villages, kill everyone they could, and bring back scalps as proof. There was no verification process, no way to confirm the victims had been hostile. A scalp was a scalp, and it paid the same regardless. This practice was government-sanctioned genocide dressed up as frontier justice. It continued for years in various forms, contributing to the decimation of native populations across the West. The fact that it was legal, encouraged, and profitable shows just how deeply dehumanization was baked into frontier policy. And mob violence followed the same logic. Someone was guilty because someone decided they were. Lynching on the frontier. Between 1882 and 1920, over 4,700 people were lynched in the United States. Many frontier towns had no formal legal system, making mob justice the default when someone was accused of a crime. Trials were rare, evidence was optional. A group of angry men would decide someone was guilty, and that was the end of it. The victims were disproportionately Black, Hispanic, Native American, and Chinese immigrants, targeted as much for their race as for any alleged crime. Sometimes there was no crime at all, just fear, hatred, or a convenient scapegoat. These weren't secret events. Lynchings often happened in public, sometimes even advertised in advance. Entire towns would gather to watch. Photographs were taken, postcards were made and mailed. It was a horrific stain on American history, a reminder that the frontier's lawlessness enabled the worst of human nature. But all those gunfights and mob justice pale next to the frontier's real killer, one that didn't discriminate between guilty and innocent. Child mortality. On the frontier, 1 in 3 children died before reaching age 5. 1 in 3. Families commonly had 8 to 12 children because they fully expected to lose several. Disease was the main culprit. Cholera, dysentery, whooping cough, scarlet fever, diphtheria. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no real medical intervention beyond hope and prayer. Parents would watch their children sicken and die, often within days or even hours of the first symptoms. Infant mortality was so common that some families didn't even name their babies until they'd survived the first year. Cemeteries were filled with tiny graves, often marked with simple wooden crosses or stones. The emotional toll was devastating, but it was so universal that it became normalized. Everyone lost children. Everyone knew the pain. It was just part of frontier life, an expected tragedy that families endured because they had no other choice. Nature had its own ways of making the death toll even higher. Grasshopper Plague of 1874. In the summer of 1874, a swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts descended on the Great Plains. This wasn't just a lot of bugs. This was a living cloud 1,800 miles long and 110 miles wide, blotting out the sun. They ate everything. Crops vanished within hours. They devoured the wool off sheep's backs while the animals stood there helpless. They ate wooden tool handles, curtains, and clothing right off people's bodies. Farmers watched their entire year's harvest disappear in an afternoon. There was nothing anyone could do except wait for the swarm to move on. When it finally did, it left behind complete devastation. Bare fields, bankrupt families, and starvation. Many settlers abandoned their homesteads and headed back east, defeated by insects. It was one of the most destructive natural disasters in American history, and it happened because of bugs. But at least the mail was getting faster. Frontier mail delivery before the Pony Express started in 1860. Getting a letter from the East Coast to California took 6 months. 6 months. The mail went by ship all the way around South America because there was no other reliable route. You could write a letter in January and get a response in December if you were lucky. The Pony Express changed everything, cutting delivery time to just 10 days using a relay system of riders on horseback. Young men rode 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles at stations along the route. It was dangerous, exhausting work. Riders faced blizzards, heat waves, bandits, and hostile territory, but it worked for exactly 18 months. Then the telegraph was completed in 1861, and suddenly messages could cross the country in minutes. The Pony Express went out of business almost overnight. All that bravery and innovation made obsolete by technology. Of course, not everyone made it to California at all. Donner Party. The Donner Party set out for California in 1846 with big dreams and poor planning. They took an untested shortcut and got trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains when early snow blocked the passes. Of the 87 members who started the journey, only 48 survived the winter. Many survived by eating the dead. Rescuers who finally reached them in the spring found human bones in cooking pots, evidence of what people will do when starvation takes hold. It's one of the darkest chapters of westward expansion, a reminder that nature didn't care about your manifest destiny. The survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives, some refusing to ever speak about what happened in those mountains. The Donner Party became a cautionary tale, proof that the frontier could devour you whole if you weren't prepared, lucky, or both. And even if you made it to your destination, keeping your land was another challenge entirely. Claim jumping. Here's a fun legal quirk from the homestead era. If you left your land for more than 6 months, anyone could legally take it from you. Just file a new claim, and it was theirs. Neighbors would literally watch each other's properties like hawks, waiting for someone to leave for an extended period. Medical emergency back east? Family funeral? Didn't matter. Stay gone too long, and you'd come back to find someone else living in your house, farming your fields, claiming legal ownership. Some people lost everything because they went to help a sick relative. The law was supposed to encourage people to actively work their land, but it also created a cutthroat environment where trust was a liability. You couldn't leave, couldn't take a break, couldn't deal with family emergencies without risking everything you'd built. The frontier gave land with one hand and snatched it back with the other. And if you managed to keep your claim, fire was always a threat. Frontier firefighting prairie fires moved at 30 to 60 miles per hour, driven by wind across the flat grasslands. If you saw one coming, you had minutes to act. The only known defense was to set a counterfire, burn a strip of ground ahead of the main blaze, and pray you'd created a wide enough gap to stop it. Many families died trying. They'd misjudge the wind, miscalculate the speed, or simply run out of time. The fire would overtake them, and that was that. Entire homesteads could be reduced to ash in under an hour. Livestock burned alive, crops were destroyed, families huddled in rivers or dug out cellars, hoping the flames would pass over them. Some did, some didn't. Fire was one of the most terrifying dangers on the plains because you could see it coming from miles away and still have almost no chance of stopping it. The frontier had many ways to kill you, but fire was among the fastest. The frontier's violence wasn't always driven by hatred. Sometimes it was purely transactional. Stagecoach robbery. The average stagecoach holdup lasted under 2 minutes. Bandits would stop the coach, demand the strong box, and disappear before anyone could react. Stagecoach drivers were explicitly instructed to comply immediately because the cargo was insured, but the passengers were not. Companies would rather lose the money than have dead customers and the lawsuits that followed. Passengers, on the other hand, were expected to hand over their valuables without protest. Most did. Getting shot over a pocket watch seemed like a poor trade. The romanticized version of stagecoach robberies involves dramatic chases and shootouts, but the reality was much more mundane. It was a business transaction enforced at gunpoint. Quick, efficient, and usually nonviolent as long as everyone cooperated. The bandits knew what they were doing. They'd hit multiple coaches, stash the loot, and vanish into the wilderness. It was almost boring in its predictability. Unlike the drinks that were cheaper than water. Frontier alcohol. In most frontier towns, whiskey was cheaper than water. A shot cost 5 cents. Water, on the other hand, had to be hauled from wells or rivers, and it was often contaminated with bacteria, animal waste, or mining runoff. People knew drinking the local water could kill you, so they drank whiskey instead. It was safer, more reliable, and helped numb the general misery of frontier life. Saloons were everywhere, sometimes outnumbering actual businesses. Men would drink before work, during work, and after work. Alcoholism was rampant and socially accepted. Entire towns operated in a state of low-grade drunkenness. The temperance movement eventually gained traction, partly because frontier drinking had gotten so out of control, but for decades, whiskey was essentially a survival tool. It cleaned wounds, dulled pain, and made the isolation bearable. Water was for washing, whiskey was for living. So, though some economic incentives were far darker than others, the real Wyatt Earp, the legendary lawman of Tombstone, had a criminal record that might surprise you. He was arrested multiple times for horse theft before he ever pinned on a badge. He was a known gambler who ran saloons and was accused of stagecoach robbery. His reputation as a fearless lawman came later, carefully cultivated through dime novels and his own self-promotion in old age. The real Wyatt Earp was a complicated figure, part lawman, part con man, part opportunist. He enforced the law when it suited him and bent it when that was more profitable. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral lasted 30 seconds and may have been more about a personal vendetta than justice. Earp spent his later years in California, working as a consultant on early Western films, shaping the mythology of the Old West to make himself look better. The frontier lawman image we have today owes a lot to Earp's own public relations work. But death on the frontier was documented in stranger ways. Frontier photography, post-mortem photography, was incredibly common on the frontier. When someone died, especially a child, families would pose with the body for a photograph. It was often the only photograph they'd ever have of that person. The dead would be dressed in their best clothes, seated in chairs, sometimes with their eyes propped open with small sticks to make them appear alive. Photographers became experts at making corpses look peaceful, almost sleeping. These weren't considered morbid or creepy at the time. They were treasured keepsakes, a way to remember loved ones in an era when death was constant and photography was rare and expensive. Families would display these photos in their homes, right alongside pictures of the living. The practice seems unsettling now, but on the frontier, it was a normal way to cope with loss and preserve memory. Death was too common to hide away. It was part of everyday life, captured on film and kept forever. Just as technology changed other aspects of frontier life, barbed wire wars. The invention of barbed wire in 1874 changed the frontier forever and not peacefully. Before barbed wire, the open range meant cattle could roam freely. Ranchers with large herds loved this system. But when farmers started fencing their land with cheap, effective barbed wire, it triggered violent range wars. Cowboys would ride out at night and cut the fences. Ranchers would shoot fence cutters on sight. Entire counties descended into chaos. Texas had to pass specific anti-fence cutting laws in 1884 just to stop the bloodshed. Thousands of miles of fence were destroyed. People died over where a property line should be. Barbed wire represented progress and private property rights, but it also represented the end of the open range and the cowboy way of life. The transition was brutal, marked by sabotage, murder, and legal battles that dragged on for years. A simple invention, a massive cultural shift, and a lot of violence in between. We're 20 facts into this frontier journey, and if you're still awake, your eyelids are probably getting heavier. Good. That means the history's working. Let's keep going. Frontier surgery amputation was the most common surgical procedure on the frontier, and it was about as pleasant as it sounds. Without antibiotics, a broken bone that pierced the skin almost always led to gangrene. Once infection set in, you had one option: cut off the limb before the infection spread and killed you. Surgeons used handsaws, the same kind you'd use to cut firewood. The patient would bite down on a leather strap, maybe get some whiskey if they were lucky, and then it was just raw endurance. The whole procedure took minutes because speed was critical. The faster the surgeon worked, the less blood loss and shock the patient suffered. Survival rates were shockingly low. Many people died from blood loss or infection afterward anyway. but it was still better odds than letting gangrene take over your whole body. Frontier medicine was brutal, effective in its own harsh way, and utterly merciless, though at least medical procedures didn't bankrupt you the way other things could. Gold rush prices. During the 1849 gold rush, the economics of San Francisco went completely insane. An egg cost $1, which is about $37 in today's money. A single slice of bread cost 75 cents. A pound of coffee could set you back $40. Everything was outrageously expensive because demand vastly outstripped supply. Tens of thousands of people flooded into California, but food and supplies had to be shipped in from thousands of miles away. Most miners spent far more money than they ever found in gold. They'd arrive with dreams of striking it rich and leave months later broke, exhausted, and disillusioned. The real fortunes were made by merchants who sold supplies to miners at inflated prices. Levi Strauss didn't get rich mining gold. He got rich selling durable pants to the people who did. The gold rush created wealth, absolutely, but mostly for people who never touched a pickaxe. And some of those fortunes were built on remarkably dishonest foundations. Frontier gambling. More people were killed over card games in the Old West than in bank robberies. Let that settle in for a moment. Accusing someone of cheating at cards was essentially signing your own death warrant or theirs. Pride, honor, and a few dollars in a pot were worth killing over, apparently. Saloons were filled with tense poker games where everyone was armed and everyone was watching everyone else's hands a little too closely. A misdealt card, a suspicious shuffle, or just bad luck could escalate into gunfire within seconds. Unlike the planned duels you see in movies, most of these killings were spontaneous, fueled by alcohol and anger. Someone would draw, someone else would draw faster, and the Undertaker would have another customer. Gambling was one of the few entertainments available in frontier towns, but it was also one of the deadliest. The stakes were always higher than the money on the table. Cowboy pay. The average cowboy earned between $25 and $40 per month, which works out to roughly $800 to $1,300 in today's money. Not exactly a fortune considering the work involved months on the trail, sleeping on the ground, eating dust, risking your life daily. And here's the kicker. Most cowboys spent their entire monthly wages in a single weekend when they finally reached a town. They'd blow it all on gambling, alcohol, a hot bath, maybe a new shirt, and whatever else caught their fancy after months of deprivation. By Monday morning, they'd be broke again, signing up for another cattle drive just to make enough to do it all over again. It was a cycle of hard labor and brief, explosive spending. Financial planning wasn't exactly a cowboy's strength. Then again, when you spent most of your time covered in dirt and worse, spending money on a bath didn't seem frivolous. Frontier bathing. Let's talk about hygiene, or the complete lack thereof. Most frontier settlers bathed once a month at best. Saturday night was designated as bath night in many households. A weekly ritual that sounds reasonable until you learn the details. Entire families shared the same tub of water. The same water, oldest to youngest. By the time the youngest child got in, they were essentially marinating in a soup of everyone else's dirt, sweat, and God knows what else. Water was hard to come by, and heating enough for multiple baths was impractical, so they made do. People reeked constantly. Body odor mixed with wood smoke, animal smells, and unwashed clothing created a frontier perfume that would probably knock you unconscious today. But everyone smelled bad, so no one really noticed or cared. It was just part of life. And if the bathing situation sounds rough, the housing was somehow worse. Sodbuster houses out on the Great Plains, trees were scarce, so settlers got creative with building materials. They built houses from sod, which is essentially bricks made of dirt and grass roots stacked together. These sodbuster houses were dark, damp, and alive with unwanted guests. Snakes would slither through cracks in the walls. Insects nested in the ceiling. Mice and rats made themselves at home. And because the ceiling was literally made of dirt and grass, things would constantly fall from above while you were trying to sleep, eat, or just exist. You'd wake up with a snake on your pillow or a mouse in your hair. Bugs would drop into your soup. During rainstorms, the ceiling would leak mud onto everything inside. It was like living in a barely controlled dirt pile. But rent was free, and it beat freezing to death, so people made it work. They didn't have much choice, and even the homes they built weren't safe from sudden disaster. Sod house fires. When a sod house caught fire from a cooking stove or lamp, the dried grass and roots in the walls would ignite rapidly. What looked like a fireproof dirt structure could become an inferno in minutes. Families had barely enough time to grab each other and run before the entire ceiling collapsed inward in a shower of burning dirt and debris. Everything inside would be destroyed: clothing, furniture, food stores, family heirlooms, tools. Starting over meant building another sod house from scratch and replacing everything they owned, which most families couldn't afford to do. Some never recovered from a house fire. They'd abandon their claim and head back east or to a town, defeated by a single accident. Fire prevention was nearly impossible when your heat source and cooking method involved open flames inside walls made of dried plant material. It was a design flaw everyone just lived with until they could afford lumber. But some conflicts on the frontier weren't accidents at all. The Bozeman Trail. The Bozeman Trail through Wyoming was supposed to be a shortcut to the Montana goldfields. Instead, it became a war zone. The trail cut directly through Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho hunting grounds, violating treaties. Attacks on wagon trains were frequent and brutal. The U.S. Army built 3 forts along the route to protect travelers: Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith. It didn't help. Red Cloud's War lasted from 1866 to 1868, with Native forces consistently outmaneuvering and defeating Army units. So, eventually, the government gave up. All 3 forts were abandoned, and the Bozeman Trail was officially closed. It remains the only war the U.S. government formally lost to a Native nation. Red Cloud had won by making the trail so dangerous that it simply wasn't worth it anymore. The forts were burned to the ground the moment soldiers left. It was a rare victory in a long, tragic conflict. Meanwhile, education on the frontier came with its own challenges. Frontier schools, one-room schoolhouses, were the norm across the frontier, and they were exercises in chaos management. Students aged 5 to 18 would all cram into the same room, sitting on rough wooden benches, sharing a handful of textbooks if they were lucky. The teacher was often barely older than the oldest students, maybe 16 or 17, hired simply because they could read and write. Teachers earned less than cowboys, sometimes paid in room and board rather than actual money. Discipline was maintained with a switch or a paddle. The curriculum was basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, and not much else. School was held when it was convenient, skipped during planting and harvest seasons when children were needed on the farm. Many kids attended sporadically, if at all. Literacy rates were low, but given the circumstances, it's surprising they weren't lower. Education was valued theoretically, but survival always came first, and some survival tactics were devastatingly effective. Buffalo hunters, professional buffalo hunters, killed an estimated 4.5 million buffalo in just 3 years, from 1872 to 1875. 4.5 million. The U.S. government actively encouraged this slaughter because they knew Plains tribes depended on buffalo for food, clothing, shelter, and tools. Kill the buffalo, starve the tribes, force them onto reservations. It was a deliberate strategy of ecological warfare. Hunters would shoot buffalo from trains, leaving the carcasses to rot on the prairie. They'd take only the hides and tongues which could be sold and abandon the rest. The Great Plains, once covered with massive herds, became a graveyard of bones. Eventually, those bones were collected and ground into fertilizer because even in death, the buffalo were valuable. By 1880, the buffalo were nearly extinct, and the Plains tribes were broken, starving, and confined to reservations. It was efficient, brutal, and exactly what it was designed to do. And where buffalo hunters worked openly, other crimes happened in secret. Homestead fraud. Up to 50% of homestead claims were fraudulent. Think about that. Half. Land speculators found every loophole imaginable. They'd hire people to file false claims, build a minimal structure, sometimes literally just a dollhouse-sized shack, take a photograph as proof of residence, and then transfer the deed. Some built structures on wheels and moved them from claim to claim for multiple photos. Others would file claims, establish minimal residency for the required time, then immediately sell the land to speculators. The Homestead Act was supposed to give land to ordinary families, but it became a bonanza for con artists and corporations. The government tried to crack down, but enforcement was nearly impossible across millions of acres of frontier territory. By the time investigators arrived, the fraudsters were long gone, the paperwork was in order, and proving fraud was almost impossible. It was the Wild West in every sense, including legally. Death, meanwhile, was a surprisingly disorganized affair. Frontier undertakers. Many frontier towns had no professional undertaker at all. When someone died, the community just handled it themselves. Bodies were wrapped in blankets or whatever fabric was available and buried the same day to prevent disease from spreading in the heat. Coffins were a luxury most people couldn't afford. If you were lucky, a local carpenter might build a simple pine box. If not, you went into the ground wrapped in cloth. Graves were dug by friends, family, or neighbors. Funerals were brief, practical affairs. A few words, maybe a hymn if someone could carry a tune, and then everyone went back to work because there were crops to tend and livestock to feed. Death was so common that elaborate mourning rituals were impossible to maintain. You grieved while you worked, or you didn't grieve at all. Life on the frontier didn't pause for death. It just kept moving, relentless and indifferent. And some entrepreneurs found creative ways to make money off that indifference. Rattlesnake whiskey. Some frontier saloons sold what they called rattlesnake whiskey, regular whiskey with a dead rattlesnake stuffed in the bottle. The snake would steep in the alcohol, supposedly infusing it with medicinal properties. People believed it cured rheumatism, improved virility, and prevented illness. None of this was true, of course, but that didn't stop sales. The whiskey probably tasted terrible, and the snake added exactly 0 health benefits, but it looked impressive on a shelf and gave customers a story to tell. Frontier medicine was filled with these kinds of folk remedies, ranging from harmless but useless to actively dangerous. Snake oil salesmen weren't just a metaphor. They were actual people selling actual fake cures to desperate folks who had no access to real medical care. Rattlesnake whiskey was just one example of frontier entrepreneurship meeting frontier gullibility. And speaking of things that didn't last, most towns had similarly short lifespans. Ghost towns. Of the thousands of mining towns built during the gold and silver rushes, over 90% became ghost towns within 10 to 20 years. The pattern was predictable. Someone strikes gold or silver, a town springs up overnight, thousands of people flood in hoping to get rich, the ore runs out, and everyone leaves. Buildings were abandoned mid-construction, saloons still had bottles on the shelves, homes had furniture inside, left behind because it wasn't worth the cost of moving. These ghost towns are scattered across the West, silent monuments to boom and bust economics. Some are tourist attractions now, preserved as historical sites. Others have crumbled into dust, reclaimed by the desert or forest. At their peak, these towns were vibrant, chaotic places filled with hope and hustle. A few years later, they were empty shells haunted by wind and memories. The frontier moved fast and it rarely looked back. Though some people found opportunities, others didn't. Women on the frontier. Here's an interesting contradiction. Women could legally own property in some Western territories before they could vote. Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1869, 51 years before the 19th Amendment made it national. This wasn't purely progressive thinking. Territorial governments wanted to attract more women to settle the region, and property rights were an incentive. Women could homestead, run businesses, and own land outright in places where their Eastern counterparts had almost no legal rights. Some women thrived in this environment, building ranches and businesses, becoming financially independent in ways that would have been impossible back east. Of course, this freedom came with all the same dangers and hardships men faced: isolation, violence, disease, and backbreaking labor. The frontier didn't care about your gender when it came to suffering, but for women willing to risk it, the West offered opportunities that simply didn't exist anywhere else in America at the time. And some of those opportunities were unconventional to say the least. Frontier prostitution. In many mining towns, the ratio was stark. Prostitutes outnumbered so called respectable women 25 to 1. In places where men vastly outnumbered women, the oldest profession thrived. Some of these women became the wealthiest residents in town, owning property, running businesses, and wielding considerable influence. They funded churches, schools, and civic improvements, often more generously than the mine owners. Despite the social stigma, they were essential to the economy and social fabric of frontier towns. Many had little choice in the profession. Economic desperation drove them west. Others saw it as the best available option in a limited range of terrible choices. Their lives were hard, often short, and rarely acknowledged in official histories. But they were there, in every frontier town, part of the complicated, messy reality that gets left out of sanitized Western mythology. Meanwhile, other groups faced even worse treatment. 40 facts deep now. We're not even halfway through, and the frontier is already stranger and darker than anything Hollywood ever showed you. Get comfortable. There's plenty more ahead. The Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese immigrants built much of the Transcontinental Railroad, doing the most dangerous work for the lowest pay. They blasted tunnels through mountains, laid track across deserts, and died by the hundreds. When the railroad was completed in 1869, their reward was being scapegoated for economic problems they had nothing to do with. By 1882, anti-Chinese sentiment had grown so strong that Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law to ban immigration based solely on nationality. Chinese workers who'd risk everything to build America's infrastructure were suddenly unwelcome in the country they'd helped construct. The law stayed in effect until 1943. It was a shameful chapter of frontier history, proof that the American dream had fine print excluding certain people. The contributions Chinese immigrants made were enormous, but the gratitude they received was non-existent, and the dangers they faced were very real. Railroad worker deaths. An estimated 1,200 Chinese workers died building the Transcontinental Railroad. They handled nitroglycerin for tunnel blasting, worked in avalanche zones, and faced conditions that white workers refused to accept. When they died, their bodies were shipped back to China in barrels when possible, a practice that honored their wish to be buried in their homeland. But many couldn't be recovered or identified. They're buried in unmarked graves along the rail line, forgotten casualties of westward expansion. The railroad companies kept poor records of Chinese workers, so the exact death toll will never be known. What we do know is that they did the hardest, most dangerous work for a fraction of the pay, and when the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit in Utah, no Chinese workers were in the official photographs. Their labor built the railroad. History tried to erase them from it. But erasure happened in other ways too, particularly to mental health. Frontier insanity, prairie madness, was a recognized medical condition among frontier settlers, particularly women. The isolation was crushing. Imagine living in a sod house on the Great Plains with the nearest neighbor 5 miles away, seeing the same flat horizon in every direction, hearing nothing but wind for months at a time. No conversation, no community, no variation in routine. Some people snapped. They'd have psychotic breaks, hallucinations, violent outbursts, or descend into catatonic depression. Asylums in frontier states were overwhelmed with cases of prairie madness. Doctors had no idea how to treat it because they didn't understand that prolonged isolation could break the human mind. Some people recovered when brought back to civilization, others never did. The frontier took a psychological toll that's rarely discussed in history books, but it was real, documented, and devastating. Mental health wasn't a priority when you were just trying to survive, and the asylums meant to treat these people were horrors of their own. Frontier mental asylums. If prairie madness broke you down, the asylum was supposed to put you back together. It didn't. Frontier mental asylums were nightmarish places, routinely overcrowded, understaffed, and staggeringly abusive. At the Oregon State Insane Asylum, opened in 1883, patients were packed into cells built for half their number. Beatings were common. Restraints were used not as last resorts, but as the first response to any difficult behavior. Patients were put to work in laundry rooms and farm fields, not as therapy, but because the institution needed cheap labor. What made it worse was who ended up there. Women who defied their husbands were committed. People whose families wanted their land were committed. Immigrants who spoke no English were committed simply because no one could understand them. The asylum became a tool of social control as much as a place of treatment. Some patients were never released, left to die inside regardless of whether they'd ever been truly ill at all. It was a frontier institution in the truest sense. Brutal, practical, and utterly indifferent to the people inside it. And survival on the frontier had a pretty grim timeline for certain lifestyles. Outlaw lifespans. The average frontier outlaw died by age 35. It wasn't a sustainable career path. Billy the Kid was killed at 21. Jesse James made it to 34. John Wesley Hardin survived to 42, but only because he spent 16 years in prison where people couldn't shoot him. The outlaw life was violent, paranoid, and short. You were constantly looking over your shoulder, sleeping in different places, trusting no one. Former friends would turn on you for reward money. Lawmen would hunt you relentlessly. Other outlaws would kill you to eliminate competition or settle grudges. Even if you survived the gunfights, you'd likely end up hanged after a quick trial or lynched by a mob. The romanticized version of outlaw life looks exciting. The reality was brief, brutal, and almost always ended badly. Fame didn't extend your lifespan. It just meant more people wanted you dead. Nature, meanwhile, could be just as deadly as any gunslinger. Frontier flood. The Great Flood of 1862 turned California's Central Valley into an inland sea 300 miles long and 20 miles wide. It was the result of 43 days of nearly continuous rain. Rivers overflowed, levees broke, and entire towns disappeared underwater. Sacramento was submerged under 10 feet of water. The state capitol building became an island. Governor Leland Stanford had to be rowed to his own inauguration in a boat. Thousands of people drowned. Livestock by the hundreds of thousands were killed. The economic damage was catastrophic, bankrupting the state. The flood reshaped California's geography permanently, depositing sediment that changed river courses and created new lakes. It remains one of the worst natural disasters in California history, though it's largely forgotten now. Modern development has made a similar flood potentially even more catastrophic. The frontier was vulnerable to nature's whims in ways we can barely imagine today, though some violence was purely human invention. Gunfight, rarity Hollywood style quick draw gunfights, were extremely rare on the frontier. Most killings were ambushes, drunken brawls, or shots in the back. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone lasted 30 seconds and involved men shooting from a few feet away, not a dramatic standoff. Real gunfights were messy, chaotic, and over quickly. Accuracy was terrible. People missed at point blank range. The whole mythology of the gunfighter drawing faster than his opponent is largely fiction created by dime novels and later reinforced by movies. Yes, some men were better shots than others, and yes, some had reputations as dangerous. But the formalized duel situation we think of as typical was actually exceptional. Most frontier violence was far less honorable and far more brutal than popular culture suggests. It was murder, plain and simple, dressed up in myth decades later. Meanwhile, the daily challenges of simply eating were considerable. Frontier food preservation. Without refrigeration, frontier families had to get creative with keeping meat from spoiling. Salting, smoking, and drying were the main methods, and all of them required constant attention and effort. Pemmican was one of the most efficient solutions. Dried buffalo meat pounded into powder, mixed with rendered fat and berries, then packed tightly. It could last for years without spoiling and provided dense nutrition for long journeys. A small pouch of pemmican could keep you alive for days. Smoking meat required building a smokehouse and maintaining a fire for hours or days, depending on the quantity. Salting drew out moisture, but also drew out flavor, leaving everything tasting like the ocean. None of these methods produced anything you'd actually enjoy eating, but they kept you from starving through the winter. Frontier food was about survival, not pleasure. Every meal was a reminder that nature didn't care if you lived or died, and some people took that indifference to extremes. Mountain men. Hygiene mountain men like Jim Bridger were legendary for many things, but personal hygiene wasn't one of them. Bridger reportedly went years without bathing, living in buckskins that became so encrusted with dirt, grease, and blood that they could practically stand up on their own. Other trappers and mountain men described him as smelling so powerfully bad that horses would refuse to let him ride them. This wasn't unique to Bridger. Many mountain men spent months or years in the wilderness without access to soap, clean water, or any reason to care about how they smelled. They lived alongside animals, slept in animal skins, and ate with their hands. The accumulation of body odor, smoke, rancid grease, and general filth created a smell that would knock you backwards in a stiff breeze. But they were surviving in environments that would kill most people, so maybe personal hygiene was a reasonable sacrifice. That said, even civilized society had its own aromatic challenges. Frontier newspapers. Frontier newspapers were wild, lawless things, printed on hand presses in the backs of saloons or general stores. Editors openly printed rumors, insults, and personal attacks with no concern for libel laws because there weren't any, really. If you angered an editor, they'd publish your name alongside accusations that might or might not be true. Rival newspapers would print competing versions of the same events, each calling the other liars. This led to violence. Editors were commonly assaulted, challenged to duels, or outright killed by people they'd written about. Mark Twain worked as a newspaper editor in Nevada and had to flee the territory after challenging a rival editor to a duel. He later wrote about the experience with his characteristic humor, but at the time it was genuinely life-threatening. Frontier journalism was personal, vicious, and dangerous. The First Amendment existed, but frontier editors tested its limits daily, and newspapers weren't the only ones documenting disaster. Starvation winters. The winter of 1886 to 1887, called the Great Die-Up, was catastrophic for the cattle industry. Temperatures on the northern plains dropped to levels that killed livestock by the hundreds of thousands. An estimated 90% of cattle died that winter. Cowboys rode out in blizzards and found cattle frozen standing upright in snowdrifts and preserved in position like statues. The ground was too frozen to bury them, so they stayed there until spring thaw. Ranchers who'd invested everything in their herds were bankrupted overnight. The open range cattle industry never fully recovered. It forced the industry to adapt. Better winter shelters, stored hay, smaller herds. The frontier had a way of teaching lessons through absolute devastation. Nature didn't negotiate or show mercy. You either adapted or you were destroyed. And speaking of adaptation, some experiments failed more spectacularly than others. Camel Corps. In 1856, the U.S. Army imported 77 camels to the Southwest, convinced they'd be superior to horses in desert conditions. On paper, it made sense. Camels can go longer without water, carry heavier loads, and handle heat better than horses. The experiment failed spectacularly for one simple reason. Horses were absolutely terrified of camels. They'd panic, throw riders, and stampede at the sight or smell of a camel. Soldiers hated riding camels, which have an entirely different gait than horses and were described as deeply uncomfortable. The camels themselves were temperamental, spit at handlers, and bit people. When the Civil War started in 1861, the whole experiment was abandoned. The camels were sold off or simply released into the desert. For decades afterward, prospectors would report seeing wild camels wandering Arizona, descendants of the Army's failed experiment. Sometimes the frontier's innovations were brilliant. This wasn't one of them. Frontier medicine shows. Traveling medicine shows rolled through frontier towns promising miracle cures in bottles. Chow. These patent medicines contained varying combinations of alcohol, opium, cocaine, and mercury. They cured absolutely nothing but created addictions across the frontier. The medicine men would set up in town squares, give elaborate pitches complete with testimonials from planted audience members, and sell bottles for $1 or $2. People bought them desperately, hoping for relief from pain, illness, or just the misery of frontier life. The tonics did provide temporary relief because they were essentially liquid drugs, but the underlying conditions remained untreated. Some people became severely addicted to these medicines, needing multiple bottles a week just to function. There was no regulation, no oversight, no consequences for the sellers. They'd clean out a town, move to the next one, and repeat. Shoo. The frontier's lack of medical care created a perfect market for con artists selling poison as cure. And the death toll from official policies was even worse. Manifest Destiny Body Count. The Native American population dropped catastrophically during westward expansion. Estimates suggest the population fell from somewhere between 5 and 15 million in 1492 to roughly 237,000 by 1900. Disease was the primary killer. Smallpox, measles, typhoid, and other illnesses brought by European settlers decimated populations that had no immunity. Warfare killed thousands more as tribes fought to defend their lands against overwhelming military force. Forced relocation onto reservations separated people from traditional food sources, leading to starvation. The combination of disease, warfare, and deliberate policy created a humanitarian catastrophe that's almost impossible to comprehend in scope. Entire cultures, languages, and ways of life disappeared within a few generations. The frontier expansion came at a human cost that history books often minimize or ignore entirely. These weren't abstract numbers. They were millions of individuals, families, and communities erased from the landscape. Meanwhile, violence between individuals followed its own bizarre rules. And with that, we're past the halfway point. 55 facts about the American frontier, and we haven't even gotten to the Native American boarding schools, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, or the horrors of convict leasing. Your pillow is probably feeling pretty good right about now. Let's continue. Frontier dueling. In many frontier territories, dueling was technically legal, or at least not actively prosecuted. Andrew Jackson, before becoming president, fought in over a dozen duels and killed at least one man. Dueling was seen as a way to settle matters of honor when the legal system was non-existent or untrustworthy. The rules were fairly standardized. Seconds would be chosen, weapons agreed upon, usually pistols, and a location selected. Both parties would show up at dawn, take their positions, and fire. Sometimes both missed. Sometimes both died. Often it was one or the other. Dueling gradually fell out of favor as formal legal systems developed, but it persisted in frontier areas well into the late 1800s. It was an accepted, even respected way to handle disputes, which seems insane by modern standards. But on the frontier, where law was uncertain and reputation was everything, dueling made a certain violent sense, though some events involved far more people than just two shooters. Land Run of 1889. When Oklahoma opened for settlement, 50,000 people lined up at the territorial border waiting for the signal. At noon on April 22nd, 1889, a cannon fired and chaos erupted. People charged forward on horses, in wagons, on trains, even on foot, racing to claim the best land. By nightfall, Oklahoma City had 10,000 residents living in tents and makeshift shelters. People who snuck across the border early to stake claims before the official start were called Sooners, a name that stuck and eventually became Oklahoma's nickname. There were fights, shootings, and legal disputes over overlapping claims that lasted for years. Some people claimed the same plot of land simultaneously, leading to standoffs and occasional violence. It was westward expansion at its most frantic and chaotic, a perfect encapsulation of frontier lawlessness and opportunity happening simultaneously. And if you were caught breaking laws in Oklahoma or elsewhere, the punishments were severe. Frontier Prison, Yuma Territorial Prison in Arizona was known as the Hellhole, and the name was earned. Temperatures inside the cells regularly reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit during summer. Prisoners were packed into small stone cells with minimal ventilation. As punishment, inmates could be chained to the floor in a dark cell carved from solid rock, left in complete darkness for days or weeks. Water was rationed. Our food was barely adequate. Escape attempts were common and usually failed, ending with recapture or death in the desert. The prison operated from 1876 to 1909 and held over 3,000 prisoners during that time. It's a museum now, preserved as a historical site, but standing inside those cells in summer heat gives you an immediate understanding of why it was considered one of the worst prisons in America. Punishment on the frontier wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about suffering as deterrent. And some industries were even deadlier than prison. Sawmill injuries lumber camps in the Pacific Northwest had the highest injury rate of any frontier industry. And that's saying something. 1 in 3 loggers was injured or killed on the job. Missing fingers were so common among sawmill workers that they had a nickname, Sawmill Souvenirs. The work involved massive trees, primitive equipment, and almost no safety regulations. Men worked with axes, handsaws, and eventually steam-powered saws that could remove a hand in a fraction of a second. Logs would roll unexpectedly, crushing workers. Trees would fall wrong, killing the person who cut them down. The climate was wet and cold, making everything slippery and dangerous. Medical care was minimal or non-existent in remote camps. If you got hurt badly, you'd likely die before reaching a doctor, but the lumber industry paid better than farming, so men took the risk. The forests of the Pacific Northwest were built on injury, disability, and death. Meanwhile, some towns were lawless in entirely different ways. The Deadwood lawlessness. Deadwood, South Dakota had no law enforcement whatsoever during its first year of existence. It was a mining camp that exploded into a town overnight, filled with prospectors, gamblers, and opportunists. Wild Bill Hickok, the famous gunfighter, was shot in the back of the head while playing poker in a Deadwood saloon. The hand he was holding, aces and eights, became known forever after as the dead man's hand. His killer was eventually tried and hanged, but only because the town finally established some form of legal system. Before that, murder was just something that happened, recorded in newspaper accounts but rarely punished. Deadwood was chaos incarnate, a place where anything could happen, and frequently did. Eventually, it settled down, got a sheriff, and became a relatively normal town. But for that first year, it was as close to pure lawlessness as America ever got. And lawlessness created orphans at an alarming rate. Frontier orphans. Thousands of children were orphaned on the trails west when their parents died from disease, accidents, or violence. Sometimes other families in the wagon train would adopt them, adding another mouth to feed out of basic human decency. Other times, children were simply abandoned at the next settlement, left at churches, or dropped off with strangers. There was no organized foster care system, no orphanages in most frontier towns. Older children might find work as ranch hands or domestic servants, essentially raising themselves. Younger children faced grimmer prospects. Some died from neglect or starvation. Others were taken in by families who treated them as free labor rather than children. The lucky ones found people who genuinely cared for them. But luck was in short supply on the frontier, and orphan children were plentiful. Their stories are mostly lost to history, small tragedies overwhelmed by larger ones. And speaking of overwhelming forces, some military engagements were disasters from the start. Custer's miscalculation. At the Battle of Little Bighorn, General George Armstrong Custer led 210 men into an attack against a combined camp of 7,000 to 8,000 Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho. The numbers weren't even close. Custer had divided his forces, underestimated the size of the encampment, and refused to wait for reinforcements. The battle lasted less than an hour. No soldier in Custer's immediate command survived to tell what happened. Native accounts describe a confused, desperate fight where soldiers were quickly surrounded and overwhelmed. Custer's decision-making that day has been analyzed endlessly, but the basic facts are clear. He attacked a vastly superior force and paid the ultimate price. The battle became famous not because it was typical, but because it was such a complete disaster. It showed that the U.S. Army wasn't invincible, and that Native warriors, when properly organized and defending their homes, were formidable opponents. But while generals made catastrophic decisions on battlefields, ordinary families fought smaller, quieter battles every single day. Battles that left their own scars. Frontier laundry. Washing clothes on the frontier took an entire day and destroyed your hands in the process. Women would boil clothes in large pots filled with water and lye soap made from animal fat and wood ash. Lye is caustic, burning skin on contact, leaving hands raw, cracked, and bleeding. The clothes had to be stirred with a stick, scrubbed against washboards, rinsed multiple times, wrung out by hand, and hung to dry. In winter, clothes would freeze solid on the line and had to be brought inside stiff as boards. The whole process was exhausting, painful, and unavoidable. Clean clothes weren't a luxury. They were a necessity that required brutal physical labor. Most women did laundry once a week, dedicating an entire day to the task. Their hands bore permanent scars from lye burns and rough fabric. Modern washing machines are a miracle we take for granted, but frontier women would have wept with gratitude for them. Sioux, and while laundry was hard, some towns thrived despite their hardships. Tombstone's real economy. Tombstone, Arizona is famous for the gunfight at the OK Corral, but that's not what built the town. Silver mining created Tombstone. At its peak, the town had a population of 15,000 and was one of the richest cities in the West. It had 110 saloons, 14 gambling halls, theaters, newspapers, and a functional government. The mines produced millions of dollars in silver. Yes, there were gunfights and violence, but that was true of most frontier towns. What made Tombstone unique was its wealth and rapid growth. The gunfight that made it famous lasted 30 seconds and killed 3 people. The silver mines employed hundreds and operated for decades. History remembers the violence because it's dramatic. But the real story of Tombstone is economic. How silver turned a desert outpost into a booming city almost overnight, and how the city survived even after the mines flooded and closed. Economics built the frontier, not shootouts. Though survival still came down to basic necessities like food. Trail food. The standard diet on the Oregon Trail was monotonous to the point of torture. Bacon, beans, coffee, and hardtack. Hardtack was a flour and water cracker baked so hard it could break your teeth. You had to soak it in water or coffee to make it edible, or smash it with a rock. It tasted like absolutely nothing, which was probably better than tasting like something terrible. This diet continued for months, meal after meal, day after day. Scurvy became common because there were almost no fresh fruits or vegetables. Hunting supplemented the diet when possible, but game was unpredictable. People dreamed about fresh bread, vegetables, anything with flavor or texture. When families finally reached their destination, the first thing many did was plant gardens, desperate for food that wasn't dried, salted, or rock hard. Trail food kept you alive, barely, but it was nobody's idea of living well. And getting food to your destination was its own deadly challenge. Frontier bridges river crossings were the deadliest part of the westward journey, more dangerous than disease, starvation, or attacks. More settlers drowned crossing rivers than died from any other single cause. There were no bridges across major rivers on most trails. Wagons had to be floated across on makeshift rafts, logs lashed together and loaded with supplies. Livestock were forced to swim across, often drowning in the current or being swept away. People drowned trying to help. Spring runoff made rivers especially dangerous, turning calm streams into raging torrents. Families would sometimes wait days or weeks for water levels to drop, wasting precious time and supplies. Some paid exorbitant fees to ferry operators when they existed. Others just took their chances and prayed. The bottom of many western rivers is littered with broken wagons, lost supplies, and human remains from crossings gone wrong. Water, ironically, was one of the frontier's greatest killers. And before people even reached rivers, territories were already battlegrounds. 75 facts in. The frontier is winding down, but the stories aren't getting any less strange. If you're drifting off, that's perfectly fine. The history will be here when you wake up. Bleeding Kansas. Before the Civil War officially started, Kansas Territory became a violent preview of what was coming. From 1854 to 1861, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers waged war against each other in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Raids, murders, and arson were daily occurrences. Entire towns were burned. People were killed for their political beliefs. John Brown, who would later lead the raid on Harper's Ferry, participated in several Kansas massacres. The violence was so intense that it shocked the nation and accelerated the march toward civil war. Kansas was supposed to decide via popular vote whether to allow slavery, but what actually happened was armed settlers from both sides, flooding the territory to influence the outcome, then fighting when voting didn't produce the results they wanted. Democracy failed in Kansas. Violence filled the gap. It was a territorial civil war that foreshadowed the national one, and violence wasn't the only thing settlers faced when they arrived. Frontier advertising railroad companies advertised the Great Plains as a Garden of Eden to lure European immigrants westward. They published pamphlets showing lush farmland, abundant water, and prosperous communities. They lied comprehensively. Immigrants arrived to find treeless, waterless prairie that couldn't sustain traditional European farming methods. The soil was tough and thick, requiring specialized plows. Water had to be dug from wells sometimes hundreds of feet deep. Trees had to be imported and planted if you wanted shade or windbreaks. Many immigrants, especially those from forested regions of Europe, were completely unprepared for the reality of prairie life. Some adapted, learning new techniques and surviving. Others gave up and went back or moved to cities. The railroad companies didn't care. They'd sold tickets, filled their trains, and met their settlement quotas. Whether people actually succeeded once they arrived wasn't their problem. It was frontier capitalism at its most ruthless, selling dreams that were often nightmares. And nightmares came in many forms, including wildlife, bear attacks. Grizzly bear encounters were so common on the frontier that Lewis and Clark's expedition reported being charged by grizzlies almost daily while traveling through Montana. These weren't timid black bears you could scare away with loud noises. Grizzlies were massive, aggressive, and territorial. The expedition's journals document shooting several bears that took 10 or more bullets to kill and kept charging even after being hit multiple times. Mountain men and trappers learned to travel in groups and stay constantly alert because a grizzly could emerge from anywhere. The bears were attracted to food supplies, and confrontations were inevitable when humans settled in their territory. Before modern rifles, killing a grizzly was genuinely difficult and dangerous. Many settlers died from bear attacks, either killed outright or succumbing to infected wounds afterward. The frontier shared space with apex predators, and humans weren't always at the top of the food chain. Surviving the wildlife was one thing. Surviving the economy was another challenge entirely. Frontier banking. Most frontier towns had no banks whatsoever. There was nowhere safe to store money, so people buried it in tin cans around their property. The problem was obvious. If you died without telling anyone where you'd hidden your money, it was lost forever. Construction crews across the West still occasionally find buried caches of coins and bills from the 1800s, money hidden by people who never got the chance to dig it up. Some settlers were killed suddenly in accidents or attacks. Others developed dementia and forgot where they'd buried their savings. Without banks, there were no records, no way to trace ownership. Your wealth existed only in your memory and maybe a hand-drawn map you hoped your family would find. It was an incredibly insecure system, but it was the only option available. Frontier finance was literally burying money in the ground and hoping for the best. And hope was in short supply when official violence occurred. Sand Creek Massacre. In 1864, U.S. soldiers attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho camp at Sand Creek, Colorado. The camp was flying both an American flag and a white flag of truce, but Colonel John Chivington ordered the attack anyway. Over 150 people were killed, mostly women, children, and elderly, as the warriors were away hunting. Soldiers took body parts as trophies. The massacre was condemned even at the time, with military investigations calling it indefensible. Chivington was never prosecuted. The attack violated treaties and basic rules of warfare, but no one faced consequences. It remains one of the darkest incidents of frontier history. A reminder that official military action could be just as brutal as any outlaw violence. The survivors carried the trauma for generations. The incident shattered any remaining trust between Plains tribes and the U.S. government, and government sanctioned destruction took other forms as well. Frontier pollution, hydraulic gold mining was an environmental catastrophe. Miners blasted entire mountainsides with high pressure water cannons, washing away hillsides to expose gold bearing gravel underneath. The process dumped millions of tons of sediment and debris into rivers and streams. The Sacramento Valley flooded repeatedly because rivers were choked with mining debris, raising water levels and destroying the natural drainage. Farm fields were buried under feet of mining sediment. The pollution destroyed fisheries and contaminated water supplies. California finally banned hydraulic mining in 1884 after a landmark lawsuit, but the damage was already done. Rivers remained polluted for decades. The landscape was permanently scarred. It was one of the first major environmental disasters caused by American industry, a preview of conflicts between economic development and environmental protection that continue today. The frontier extracted wealth while destroying ecosystems, leaving future generations to deal with the consequences. And some jobs required youth and desperation in equal measure. Pony Express riders. Pony Express riders had to weigh under 125 pounds, which meant they were usually teenagers or very small adults. They rode 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles at relay stations. The youngest known rider was 11 years old. Think about that for a moment. An 11-year-old riding alone through wilderness, carrying mail, facing weather, bandits, and wildlife. The job paid well by frontier standards, but was incredibly dangerous. Riders were expected to outrun trouble, not fight it. They traveled light, carrying only the mail, water, and a weapon. Some died from falls, attacks, or exposure. Others were injured, but kept riding because the mail had to get through. The Pony Express only lasted 18 months before the telegraph made it obsolete, but in that brief time, it became legendary. Young riders risking everything to deliver letters across impossible distances captured the frontier imagination, though death itself created impossible situations. Frontier funerals. In winter, the ground on the frontier was often frozen too hard to dig graves. Bodies couldn't be buried, so they had to be stored somewhere until spring thaw. Families would keep their dead relatives in sheds, barns, or unheated rooms, essentially living with corpses for months. The cold preserved the bodies well enough, but it was psychologically devastating. You'd walk past your father's body every day for 3 months until the ground thawed enough to bury him. Some communities had communal storage areas for winter dead, grim warehouses where bodies accumulated until spring. When the thaw finally came, there would be mass burial days where the community would bury all the winter dead at once. It was practical, necessary, and deeply traumatic. Death on the frontier didn't get the rituals and closure we consider normal today. You dealt with it however you could and moved on because survival didn't pause for grief. And some tragedies were too large to move on from. The Long Walk. In 1864, the U.S. government forced 8,000 to 9,000 Navajo people to walk 300 miles from their homeland to a reservation at Bosque Redondo, New Mexico. The journey became known as the Long Walk, and it was brutal. Hundreds died from exposure, starvation, and exhaustion along the way. The sick and elderly who couldn't keep up were sometimes left behind or killed. The reservation itself was a disaster. Poor soil, contaminated water, and not enough food. Thousands more died from disease and starvation after arrival. The Navajo call it a time of incredible suffering, a forced removal that nearly destroyed their people. 4 years later, the government admitted the reservation experiment had failed and allowed survivors to return home, but the damage was permanent. An entire generation lost, traditional ways disrupted, trauma embedded in cultural memory. The Long Walk stands as one of the clearest examples of how frontier expansion devastated indigenous peoples through deliberate policy. But the frontier broke trust in other ways too. Even the money couldn't be trusted. Frontier forgery counterfeit money was so common on the frontier that many transactions simply reverted to barter. Why trust paper money when half of it might be fake? There was no way to verify currency in most frontier towns. No banks to check with, no authorities to authenticate bills. Con artists printed fake money and spent it freely, moving to the next town before anyone noticed. Some communities gave up on currency entirely and went back to trading goods directly. Beaver pelts became an accepted currency in many areas well into the 1870s. A good pelt had obvious value and couldn't be counterfeited. Storekeepers would accept furs, grain, or labor instead of cash, because at least those had verifiable worth. The frontier's distance from established financial systems created chaos that clever criminals exploited ruthlessly. Trust in currency broke down, forcing people back to economic systems that hadn't changed in centuries. And speaking of things that didn't change, certain burial grounds told their own stories. And Boot Hill cemeteries. Boot Hill cemeteries got their name from a grim detail. So many men were buried with their boots still on. This meant they'd died violently suddenly, not peacefully in bed where someone might have removed their boots. Nearly every major frontier town had a Boot Hill cemetery, filled with wooden crosses marking the graves of men killed in gunfights, hangings, accidents, or murders. The epitaphs were often darkly humorous or brutally honest. He called Bill Smith a liar or died of lead poisoning. These weren't honored graves with marble headstones. They were quick burials for people who died hard, often without family present to claim them. Boot Hills were eventually abandoned as towns grew and established proper cemeteries. Many have been preserved as tourist attractions now, invisible reminders of how casually violent frontier life could be. The boots they wore to their graves have long since rotted away, but the name stuck. Daily life required its own kind of resilience. Buffalo Bill's Wild West Buffalo, Bill Cody's Wild West show toured America and Europe, employing real Native Americans as performers. Sitting Bull, the famous Lakota leader who'd helped defeat Custer at Little Bighorn, was paid $50 per week to ride around the arena and occasionally shoot targets. It's a strange piece of history. A man who'd fought against American expansion now performing his culture for entertainment. Sitting Bull reportedly gave most of his earnings to homeless children he encountered in cities, moved by their poverty. The show employed hundreds of native performers over the years, providing income but also reinforcing stereotypes about savage Indians. It was complicated, exploitation and employment mixed together, cultural preservation and caricature happening simultaneously. Buffalo Bill himself seemed to respect his native performers more than many of his contemporaries, but the shows still reduced complex cultures to simplified spectacle. The frontier was being mythologized even as it was still happening. Real history turned into entertainment, and some crimes went beyond individual incidents. Frontier timber fraud lumber companies illegally logged millions of acres of public land across the frontier west. The practice was systematic and shameless. Companies would harvest entire forests on federal land, make enormous profits, and when caught, pay minimal fines that were a tiny fraction of what they'd earned. The government lacked the resources to patrol millions of acres of wilderness. By the time investigators arrived, the trees were already cut, milled, and sold. Enforcement was essentially impossible. Companies knew this and operated openly, bribing local officials when necessary. The scale of timber theft was staggering, contributing to deforestation across the Pacific Northwest and Rocky Mountains. Some of the wealth that built American cities came from stolen trees on stolen land. It was frontier capitalism in its purest, most ruthless form. Take what you can, pay the fine if caught, and repeat. The legal system couldn't or wouldn't stop it, and some disasters were entirely nature's doing, with no human villain to blame. Mining town fires, Virginia City. Nevada burned to the ground 4 times between 1861 and 1875. Each time the town was rebuilt, and each time it burned again. Buildings were constructed entirely of wood because it was cheap and available. Fire codes didn't exist. Heating and cooking involved open flames. Saloons and hotels stayed lit all night with oil lamps and candles. One spark in the wrong place, and entire blocks would go up. Fire spread rapidly through wooden buildings packed close together, and frontier towns had no fire departments equipped to handle major blazes. Bucket brigades did what they could, but against a real fire, they were helpless. People would grab what they could carry and run. Within hours, the entire town would be ashes. Then they'd rebuild in the exact same way because lumber was still the cheapest option. The cycle repeated until eventually fires destroyed so much that towns either improved building standards or were permanently abandoned. It was catastrophic, but predictable. Speaking of repetitive strain, technology brought new problems. Frontier telegraph operators. Telegraph operators on the frontier became some of the first people to develop repetitive strain injuries from their work. Constant key tapping for hours every day damaged hands and wrists, causing chronic pain that had no name or treatment at the time. They were also frequent robbery targets. Outlaws knew telegraph operators could send warnings to the next town, so they'd cut the lines or force operators at gunpoint to send false messages. Operators were paid poorly despite the skill and responsibility involved. They worked in tiny offices, often alone, relaying messages that could mean life or death for people hundreds of miles away. The job required literacy, technical knowledge, and the ability to work under pressure. Yet they were treated as expendable laborers. Some operators became local heroes for refusing to cooperate with criminals. Others were killed for the same reason. It was skilled work in a dangerous environment, undervalued and overlooked. And nature could be even more relentless than criminals. The winter of the blue snow. In 1886, a blizzard dropped temperatures to 60 degrees below zero in parts of Montana and the Dakotas. The snow had a strange blue tint in certain light, giving the winter its eerie name. Cowboys froze to death while still on horseback, found later as frozen statues. Cattle, driven by instinct to find shelter and food, drifted south in massive herds until they hit barbed wire fences and died in enormous piles, unable to push through or turn back against the storm. When spring came, the prairies were littered with carcasses. The smell of rotting cattle was overwhelming for months. Ranchers lost entire herds, their life savings dead in snowdrifts and against fence lines. The catastrophe forced changes in ranching practices, storing winter hay, building shelters, keeping smaller herds. But it was too late for that winter's victims. The frontier's harshest lesson was often delivered through weather that killed indiscriminately and without warning. And humans found their own ways to numb the pain. Frontier opium laudanum, which is liquid opium, was sold in every frontier general store without a prescription or any regulation. It was marketed as medicine for everything: toothaches, headaches, coughs, menstrual cramps, anxiety, insomnia. Mothers gave it to crying babies. Adults took it daily. Addiction was rampant and socially accepted because nobody understood they were addicts. They just thought they needed their medicine. Bottles were labeled with vague instructions and no warnings. People would take increasing doses as tolerance built, never realizing they were chemically dependent. Frontier society was swimming in opium addiction without recognizing it. When someone became obviously dependent, drinking entire bottles a day, they were seen as weak-willed, not sick. There was no treatment, no understanding of addiction as a medical condition. People either managed their addiction for life or died from overdose or withdrawal complications. The frontier's lack of medical knowledge enabled a drug crisis that lasted decades. Meanwhile, legal disputes created chaos of a different kind. Oklahoma land disputes. After the land run of 1889, thousands of overlapping claims created legal chaos that lasted decades. Multiple people would claim the same plot of land, each insisting they'd arrived first, staked their claim properly, and had witnesses to prove it. The courts were overwhelmed. Some disputes weren't settled until the 1920s, 40 years after the original run. Families built homes on land they thought was theirs, only to have someone show up with paperwork claiming ownership. Violence erupted. People were shot over property lines. Lawyers made fortunes sorting through the mess. The government had created a system designed to distribute land quickly, but with no plan for resolving conflicts. The resulting legal tangle consumed years of people's lives and enormous amounts of money. Some families were still fighting in court while their children grew up and had children of their own. The land run achieved settlement, but at the cost of generations of conflict. Yet some moments of clarity still emerged from the chaos. We're in the final stretch now, just a handful of facts left. If you've made it this far with your eyes open, I'm impressed. If not, sweet dreams. You've earned them. Horse theft penalty. In most frontier territories, horse theft was punished more severely than murder. This seems extreme until you understand that a horse was essential for survival. It was transportation, farm labor, and often the difference between life and death. Stealing someone's horse could sentence them to death by stranding them in wilderness or leaving them unable to work their land. So, frontier justice treated horse thieves harshly, hanging usually after quick trials or no trial at all. Vigilante groups would track down horse thieves and execute them on the spot. The punishment might seem disproportionate now, but on the frontier, that horse represented someone's entire livelihood and survival. Murder could be personal, a crime of passion or circumstance. Horse theft was calculated theft of someone's life, just slower. The frontier's harsh justice system reflected harsh realities. Resources were limited, mercy was rare, and the law protected property as fiercely as people. Speaking of records and property, some losses were irreplaceable. Frontier census. The 1890 census was supposed to be the most comprehensive record of frontier life ever compiled, documenting the people, towns, and settlements at the moment the frontier officially closed. Almost all of it was destroyed in a fire at the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. in 1921. An enormous amount of frontier history was lost permanently. Names, occupations, family structures, migration patterns, all gone. Historians have been trying to reconstruct what was lost ever since, using state copies and fragments, but the detailed federal records are simply gone forever. It's a catastrophic loss for understanding the frontier era. We know more about medieval Europe in some ways than we know about the American frontier because the records burned. The fire was accidental, but the loss was incalculable. Entire communities disappeared from history because their only documentation went up in smoke. The frontier was already fading into mythology, and losing the census accelerated that process. The records burned, the stories survived, and the biggest story of the frontier was written not in books, but in dust, sweat, and cattle. Cattle drives. The Great Cattle Drives moved 5 to 10 million cattle from Texas to railheads in Kansas between 1866 and 1886. Cowboys would spend months on the trail, moving vast herds across open country. They slept on the ground every night, ate the same food endlessly, breathed dust for weeks, and crossed rivers filled with quicksand where cattle and men could disappear in moments. A stampede could kill you in seconds. River crossings drowned men and cattle. Lightning storms spooked the herds into running. It was brutally hard, dangerous work for terrible pay. Cowboys were romanticized later, but The reality was miserable. You worked 16-hour days, slept maybe 4 hours if you were lucky, and earned just enough to blow it all in town on your one weekend off every few months. The cattle drives built the beef industry and the cowboy mythology, but the men who did the actual work were just exhausted laborers trying to survive another day. And some laborers faced restrictions that had nothing to do with the work itself. Frontier teachers. The frontier loved imposing rules on people, sometimes with contracts, sometimes with paddles, and sometimes with consequences nobody saw coming. Female frontier teachers faced strict moral codes that male teachers didn't. They were forbidden from marrying while employed, visiting saloons, smoking, or being seen in the company of men outside of school hours. Breaking any of these rules meant instant termination with no appeal. The logic was that teachers were moral examples for the community, and women especially had to maintain spotless reputations. Many young women took teaching jobs as temporary work before marriage, knowing they'd have to quit once they wed. The pay was terrible, often less than what cowboys made, and teachers frequently lived with student families, rotating between homes every few weeks. They had no privacy, no independence, and constant scrutiny. Despite these restrictions, teaching was one of the few respectable jobs available to educated women on the frontier. It offered escape from farms, a chance to travel, and at least some autonomy, even if that autonomy came with a thick rule book of prohibitions. And some incidents sparked consequences that no one could walk back. The Meeker Massacre. In 1879, Nathan Meeker served as an Indian agent at the White River Agency in Colorado, working with the Ute people. Meeker decided the Ute needed to abandon their traditional ways and become farmers. He plowed up their horse racing track to plant crops, destroying something culturally important to demonstrate his authority. The Ute, understandably furious, killed Meeker and 10 others at the agency. The incident led to public outrage and calls for the forced removal of all Ute from Colorado. Within a year, the Ute were forced onto reservations in Utah, losing their Colorado homeland forever. The massacre was tragic, but it was also the culmination of years of cultural suppression and disrespect. Meeker's actions, though well intentioned by his own lights, showed complete disregard for Ute culture and values. The violent response was treated as proof that Native people couldn't be civilized, when really it was proof that destroying someone's culture generates resistance. The Ute paid the price for one man's arrogance. Meanwhile, keeping cool required expensive solutions. Frontier ice. Before refrigeration existed, frontier towns in the South had to import ice from New England if they wanted it at all. Ice was cut from frozen lakes and ponds in winter, packed in sawdust for insulation, loaded onto trains, and shipped thousands of miles south. A 50-pound block of ice could cost as much as a full day's wages by the time it reached Texas or Arizona. It was a luxury only the wealthy could afford regularly. The ice trade was a massive industry, employing thousands and generating huge profits. Warehouses called ice houses stored the blocks through summer, losing huge amounts to melting, but still making money on what remained. When mechanical refrigeration was invented, the entire industry collapsed almost overnight. The ice harvesters, the shippers, the ice house operators, all suddenly unemployed because technology made their jobs obsolete. It's a pattern that repeated throughout frontier history. Industries rising and falling with breathtaking speed. And some communities took law into their own hands with frightening efficiency. Vigilance committees. San Francisco's Vigilance Committee of 1856 operated openly as an alternative legal system. They hanged 4 people and banished dozens more without trials, all in broad daylight with public support. The committee published newspapers explaining their actions, held meetings in public buildings, and were celebrated by much of the city. They saw themselves as necessary because the official legal system was corrupt and ineffective. They might have been right about corruption, but their solution was mob rule dressed up as civic duty. Thousands of citizens joined the committee, carrying out raids, arrests, and executions with military precision. The governor declared them in rebellion, but they had more men under arms than the state militia. Eventually, they disbanded voluntarily after declaring their work complete. No one was ever prosecuted for the vigilante actions. It remains one of the most successful and disturbing examples of vigilante justice in American history. The frontier sometimes preferred swift violence over slow justice, and some relationships were built on similarly fragile foundations. Frontier marriages, mail order brides were surprisingly common on the frontier. Men would place advertisements in Eastern newspapers describing themselves and their prospects, hoping to attract a wife. Women, often widows or those with limited economic options, would respond. They'd exchange letters for weeks or months. Then the woman would travel thousands of miles to marry a man she'd never met in person. Some marriages worked out well, built on genuine respect and partnership. Others were disasters. Men had lied about their circumstances, or personalities clashed, or expectations didn't match reality. But divorce was difficult and socially damaging, so most couples stayed together regardless. It was a gamble for both parties. Women risked traveling to remote areas to marry strangers who might be abusive or destitute. Men risked rejection or incompatibility with someone they'd spent money to bring west. The system worked often enough to persist for decades, filling the frontier with families built on hope and desperation in equal measure. Meanwhile, some resistances became legendary. Geronimo's resistance, Geronimo and a band of 38 Apaches, including women and children, evaded 5,000 U.S. soldiers and 3,000 Mexican soldiers for over a year. They moved through desert terrain they knew intimately, traveling at night, covering their tracks, living off the land. It took 1/4 of the entire U.S. Army to capture him, a massive military effort against fewer than 40 people. Geronimo's knowledge of the landscape and guerrilla tactics made him nearly impossible to catch. He finally surrendered in 1886, not because he was defeated militarily, but because his people were exhausted and starving. He spent the rest of his life as a prisoner of war, never allowed to return to his homeland. The U.S. government feared him too much to release him even as an old man. His resistance became symbolic of Apache defiance and the lengths people will go to defend their freedom and land. It was asymmetric warfare before the term existed, and it nearly worked. Nature, though, I fought with different weapons. Frontier earthquakes. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 to 1812 were among the most powerful earthquakes in American history. They were so strong they made the Mississippi River flow backward temporarily, created new lakes, rang church bells in Boston over 1,000 miles away, and were felt across half the continent. Entire islands in the Mississippi disappeared. New ones formed. The landscape changed permanently. Fortunately, the area was sparsely populated, so deaths were relatively few. If the same earthquakes hit today, the damage would be catastrophic. The frontier experienced these quakes as acts of God, terrifying displays of nature's power with no scientific explanation available. People thought it was the end of the world. Some became intensely religious. Others fled the region entirely. The earthquakes continued intermittently for months, keeping everyone in constant fear. The New Madrid seismic zone is still active today, capable of producing major earthquakes again. The frontier learned that the land itself was unstable, shifting, dangerous, and human instability created its own kind of danger. Whiskey trade. Fur traders routinely used whiskey to exploit Native Americans in trade deals. 1 cup of diluted whiskey, sometimes cut with water or worse substances, could buy a buffalo robe worth $5. The practice was technically illegal under multiple federal laws, but it was universally practiced because enforcement was impossible and profits were enormous. Traders would arrive at camps with barrels of whiskey, get people drunk, then make completely one sided trades. Some traders were killed by angry tribes who realized they'd been cheated. Others made fortunes and faced no consequences. The whiskey trade disrupted native societies, created alcohol dependency, and facilitated theft on a massive scale. Government officials knew about it, issued prohibitions, and then ignored violations because controlling trade across millions of square miles of frontier was impossible. It was exploitation enabled by distance, indifference, and greed. The frontier operated on practical economics, not legal ideals, and disease brought its own terrible practicality. Frontier quarantine. When smallpox hit a frontier town, the response was brutal and practical. The infected were sometimes walled into their homes with their families to prevent the disease from spreading. Food and water might be left outside or might not. In extreme cases, entire buildings were burned with the sick still inside to stop an outbreak. It sounds monstrous, and it was, but frontier communities faced existential threats from epidemic disease. Smallpox could kill half a town's population in weeks. Without vaccines or effective treatment, isolation and destruction were the only tools available. The decision to sacrifice a few families to save the rest was made with grim calculation. Some towns survived because of these measures. Others died anyway. Medical ethics, as we understand them today, didn't exist on the frontier. Survival of the community trumped individual rights. It was harsh, often cruel, and defended as necessary. The frontier made people make impossible choices and then live with the consequences. And some workers never had choices at all. Chinese labor camps. Chinese railroad workers lived in segregated camps, separated from white workers by company policy. They were paid 30 to 50% less for the same work, often receiving wages only in company scrip that could only be spent at company stores at inflated prices. They were given the most dangerous jobs, including handling nitroglycerin for tunnel blasting. When explosions happened, Chinese workers died in disproportionate numbers. They worked longer hours, received worse food, and had no legal recourse for mistreatment. White workers went on strike demanding Chinese workers be fired, not for better conditions for everyone, but to eliminate competition. The companies kept Chinese workers because they were cheaper and complained less, knowing they had even fewer options than white workers. It was exploitation enabled by racism and economic pressure. The workers who built critical infrastructure received the least pay, worse conditions, and no recognition. The frontier's greatest projects were built on the backs of people treated as disposable, yet some groups fought back with remarkable success. The Nez Perce Retreat. In 1877, Chief Joseph led 750 Nez Perce on an 1,170-mile fighting retreat across 4 states, trying to reach Canada and safety. They were pursued by multiple U.S. Army columns, totaling over 2,000 soldiers. For 4 months, the Nez Perce outmaneuvered, outfought, and outran the army through Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. They won several battles despite being outnumbered and having women, children, and elderly with them. They nearly made it. Right. The Canadian border was 40 miles away when they were finally surrounded and forced to surrender. Chief Joseph's surrender speech, "I will fight no more forever," became famous. The Nez Perce were sent to reservations far from their homeland. Their tactical brilliance and endurance became legendary even among the soldiers who fought them. It was one of the most remarkable military retreats in history, conducted by people fighting to keep their freedom and land. The frontier witnessed courage on both sides of every conflict. And while some people fought openly, others found darker ways to wage war. smallpox, and biological warfare. The deliberate use of disease as a weapon against Native Americans is one of the most documented and damning chapters of frontier history. The most infamous case comes from Fort Pitt in 1763. When British officers, including Sir Geoffrey Amherst, commander of British forces in North America, explicitly discussed distributing blankets from the fort's smallpox hospital to Delaware tribal leaders. Letters between officers confirmed the intent. Whether those specific blankets caused an outbreak is debated, but the documented wish to spread fatal disease to a civilian population is not. Later, as westward expansion accelerated, the U.S. Army's own records acknowledge withholding smallpox vaccinations from Native communities while providing them to white settlers. Some frontier physicians refused to vaccinate Native patients as a matter of policy. The outcome was predictable. Tribes already weakened by displacement and starvation were devastated by waves of disease they had no immunity to and no access to treatment for. The blanket story became a symbol, but the larger reality was a systematic indifference to Native lives that amounted to the same thing. And some crimes were industrial in scale. Convict leasing. After the Civil War ended slavery in 1865, Southern states found a way to resurrect it within the law. Convict leasing was the system, and it was simple and brutal. States would arrest black men on minor charges, vagrancy, loitering, unpaid debts, and lease them to mines, plantations, and railroad companies for a fee. The state got paid, the companies got forced labor, the men got nothing but suffering. In Alabama's Pratt mines in the 1880s, men convicted of stealing a single dollar's worth of goods might spend years underground in conditions that killed 1 in 10 workers every year. Because the lessees had paid for labor contracts rather than human beings they owned, they had no financial incentive to keep workers alive. Run a slave to death, and you lost your investment. Run a leased convict to death, and you just filed a request for a replacement. It was, in the assessment of historian Douglas Blackman, slavery by another name. The system persisted in various forms until the 1940s, long after the frontier had officially closed, and children faced their own form of systematic destruction. Native American boarding schools. The official policy was blunt: kill the Indian, save the man. Beginning in the 1870s and running well into the 20th century, the U.S. government forcibly removed thousands of Native children from their families and sent them to boarding schools designed to strip away every trace of their identity. The most famous was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded in 1879 by Captain Richard Henry Pratt. Children were forbidden from speaking their languages. Native names were replaced with English ones. Traditional clothing was confiscated. Hair, often sacred in Native cultures, was cut on arrival. Children who spoke their language were beaten. Letters home were monitored or destroyed. Some children died at these schools from disease, abuse, or what can only be called despair. Many were buried in unmarked graves on school grounds, hundreds of which are still being discovered today. The children who returned home as adults often found themselves belonging nowhere, too changed to fit their communities, too marked to be accepted elsewhere. It was a deliberate, systematic attempt to erase entire cultures through their youngest members. And some massacres happened not in battle, but in cold calculation. Mountain Meadows Massacre. On September 11th, 1857, a wagon train called the Baker Fancher Party was making its way through Utah Territory toward California. They carried an estimated $200,000 in cattle and supplies, a fortune by frontier standards. Over several days, a group of Mormon settlers and Paiute allies launched a coordinated attack on the wagon train near Mountain Meadows. The wagon train fought off the initial assault, so the attackers changed tactics. They raised a white flag and offered safe passage if the emigrants surrendered their weapons. The emigrants agreed. As they walked out disarmed, the signal was given. 120 men, women, and older children were killed within minutes. Only 17 children under the age of 6 were spared. Young enough, it was determined, that they wouldn't remember what they had seen. The massacre was covered up for decades. Blame was shifted entirely onto the Paiutes. It wasn't until 1877 that John D. Lee, the only participant ever prosecuted, was executed at the massacre site by firing squad. The exact chain of command, and whether the order came from Brigham Young himself, has never been definitively established. It remains one of the most disturbing and least taught massacres in American history. And racism was enforced not just through violence, but through geography. Sundown towns. Across America, thousands of towns had a rule that was sometimes posted on signs at city limits and sometimes just understood. Black people, and often Chinese, Mexican, or Jewish residents, had to be out of town by sundown or face violence. These were called sundown towns, and they were not a Southern phenomenon. They were everywhere, in Illinois, Ohio, Oregon, California, Indiana. The Midwest had some of the highest concentrations. Towns enforced these rules through beatings, shootings, arson, and occasional murder. The signs that appeared at town limits were rarely subtle. Some read simply, "Nigger, don't let the sun set on you in this town." James Loewen, the sociologist who cataloged them in his book Sundown Towns, estimated that at the peak of the practice in the mid-20th century, more than 10,000 towns across America operated under these rules. Many of these towns remained entirely white, by force, well into the 1960s and beyond. The practice is rarely discussed in frontier or American history curricula, despite having shaped the racial geography of vast stretches of the country in ways that persist to this day. The Transcontinental Railroad's cost. The Transcontinental Railroad cost roughly $1.1 billion in today's money, an enormous sum for the 1860s. To incentivize construction, the federal government gave railroad companies 175 million acres of public land, an area larger than Texas. Companies could sell this land to settlers and keep the profits. It was one of the largest transfers of public wealth to private companies in American history. The railroads made fortunes not from moving freight or passengers initially, but from selling land they'd been given for free. Towns sprang up along the rail lines because that's where the railroad companies owned land and platted settlements. The geography of the West was shaped by railroad decisions about where to lay track. It connected the continent, absolutely, but it also created massive corporate power that dominated Western politics for generations. The frontier was built as much by government giveaways as by individual pioneers. And looking back, the entire era created mythology. The Range Wars. The Johnson County War of 1892 in Wyoming saw wealthy cattlemen hire a private army of 50 gunmen to kill small ranchers they accused of cattle rustling. The hired army invaded the county, killed 2 men, and besieged a ranch. Small ranchers organized a militia and surrounded the invaders. It became a standoff that required the U.S. cavalry to intervene and prevent a massacre. The invaders were arrested, then released after charges were mysteriously dropped. No one was ever convicted despite multiple murders and an armed invasion. The wealthy cattlemen had enough political influence to escape consequences entirely. The incident exposed the power imbalances on the frontier. Wealthy interests could hire armies, commit murder, and walk away free. The small ranchers learned that the law protected property and power, not justice. It was one of the last major range wars, but it showed that frontier violence persisted even as the frontier officially closed, and nature remained indifferent to human struggles. Frontier legacy. By 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau officially declared the frontier closed. In just 50 years, Americans had colonized a landmass larger than Western Europe, displaced millions of indigenous people, and built an economy that would become the world's largest. The cost in human lives and suffering was staggering. Disease, violence, starvation, and exploitation killed hundreds of thousands. Entire cultures were destroyed. The land was permanently altered by farming, mining, logging, and development. The frontier era was brutal, chaotic, and transformative. It reshaped the continent and the people who lived on it. The survivors built towns, states, and eventually a nation that stretched ocean to ocean. The frontier officially ended, but its impact continued shaping American identity, politics, and culture for generations. What happened in those 50 years created the modern West and much of modern America. The frontier closed, but its consequences remained open. And then came the mythology that replaced reality, the myth that won't die. Despite everything, the disease, violence, starvation, and exploitation, the frontier era became America's founding myth. Dime novels started the process even while the frontier was still active, publishing wildly exaggerated stories of cowboys and outlaws. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show toured the world, presenting a sanitized, entertaining version of frontier life. Then Hollywood took over, creating an entire genre of Western films that bore little resemblance to reality. The movies showed honorable cowboys, dramatic shootouts, and simple morality. They left out the dirt, disease, racism, and grinding poverty. They turned complicated history into simple stories of good versus evil. Most Americans still believe this mythological version. The real frontier was far more complicated, far more brutal, and far more human than any movie ever showed. It was messy, morally ambiguous, and often deeply unjust. But the myth persists because people prefer simple stories to complex truth. The frontier exists now mainly as legend, and legends are always cleaner than reality. So, there you have it. 101 facts about the American frontier that your history teacher definitely skipped over. The real West wasn't about quick draw shootouts and honorable cowboys riding into sunsets. It was about survival in a landscape that wanted you dead, in a society that valued property over people, during an era when the government paid $5 for human scalps and children walked 15 miles before breakfast. Tonight, be thankful you live in an era where a toothache doesn't require a blacksmith and a bottle of whiskey, where your children aren't stripped from your arms and sent to a school designed to erase who they are, where your government doesn't pay bounties on human beings, and where sending a message doesn't require an 11-year-old riding alone through hostile territory. The frontier was many things, but comfortable wasn't one of them. Sleep well, and remember, the past is a foreign country where everything smells worse than you can possibly imagine. Sweet dreams.